When producer George Linder first set his sights on The Running Man, he was captivated by the premise, a dystopian world where desperate men run for their lives on a deadly game show, hunted by professional killers, all for the amusement of a bloodthirsty audience. It had the perfect blend of action, sci fi, and social commentary. But one thing puzzled him from the very beginning. Why were the rights to this gritty little novel so exorbitantly priced? The story had been published under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, and at the time, Linder, like many others, had no idea that name was a literary mask for one of the biggest authors on the planet, Stephen King. I just kept asking myself, why is this option fee so high? Linder recalled in a recent interview. It didn't make sense. It wasn't a bestseller, at least not under that name. It was dark, very dark, and cool, but we weren't buying Jurassic Park here. The production team moved forward anyway, biting the bullet on the rights. After all, it had everything they wanted. What they didn't realize was that they had just purchased a King property, a gold mine in Hollywood terms. It wasn't until later, after development had already begun, that the veil was lifted. We found out halfway through the process, Linder said. We were already well into planning, and someone casually mentioned that Richard Bachman was a Stephen King alias. I almost dropped my coffee. That revelation reframed everything. Suddenly, the high price made perfect sense. The obscure dystopian novel wasn't from a little-known writer. It was the work of a literary giant whose stories had already spawned blockbusters like Carrie, The Shining, and Christine. King's name practically guaranteed interest, both from studios and audiences. The irony wasn't lost on Linder. Here I was, thinking I was getting in on this under-the-radar gem. Turns out, it was King all along. I basically walked into a Ferrari showroom thinking I was buying a used Mustang. Still, knowing the story came from King didn't drastically change their approach. The Running Man was unlike his other works. It wasn't about supernatural horror or haunted houses. It was pure dystopia, laced with political commentary and a cynical view of media and class. What the production team did have to adjust to, however, was the expectation that came with King's name, even unofficially. When it came to casting, the team made an unconventional choice. Instead of a wiry, desperate everyman like the character Ben Richards in the novel, they went with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Austrian bodybuilder with a growing list of action hits. The move would later draw criticism for straying so far from the book's original tone, but for Linder and his team, it was a strategic play. Arnold was a megastar, Linder said. We knew he'd bring in a broader audience. Sure, it changed the character, but it made the story more cinematic. Instead of a powerless man on the run, we had a tank of a protagonist who looked like he could take on the entire dystopian machine. As for King, he was famously quiet about the adaptation at first. It wasn't until years later that he expressed lukewarm feelings about the films, saying it missed the novel's emotional core. The movie, with its neon-soaked aesthetics and gladiatorial bravado, leaned hard into 80s excess, a contrast to the bleak, almost nihilistic tone of the book. But despite those differences, The Running Man found an audience. It tapped into cultural fears about media sensationalism, economic disparity, and state control, themes that remain eerily relevant today. It wasn't just an action flick, it was a prophecy in latex and explosions. The movie's cultural longevity surprised even its own creators. We knew it was cool, Linder admitted, but we didn't know it would still be talked about 35 years later, or that people would be drawing comparisons to modern reality TV and surveillance capitalism. In retrospect, Linder says discovering the Stephen King connection was a bit like finding out your thrift store painting is a lost Picasso. I went into this thinking I'd found something raw and edgy from an unknown voice, he said. Instead, it was from one of the most prolific storytellers of the 20th century. I guess the joke's on me. And yet that twist only added to the movie's mystique. To this day, fans debate whether it should have been marketed more heavily with King's name, or whether its cult status benefited from being a bit of an oddity in his catalog. For Linder, the answer is clear. I'm glad it happened the way it did, he said. We approached the story without reverence or fear. We weren't trying to make a Stephen King movie. We were trying to make The Running Man. And maybe that's what gave it its own identity.